Bonjour, bienvenue.
Good day, welcome. Thank you very much for coming, for being with us. My name is David Malone. It is a pleasure for me to work in this institute.
Thank you very much for joining us, those who are watching us online, those who are here in person on what is a beautiful day outside in Ottawa. Above all, thank you to our guest, Helen Clark, the administrator of UNDP, a title that sometimes obscures the fact that she's actually the head of UNDP, which she also administers. She is a former Prime Minister of New Zealand, a remarkably successful one. She won 3 terms as Prime Minister of New Zealand between 1999 and 2008. She won 10 elections to the Parliament of her country. She chaired the Foreign Affairs Commission of the Parliament of her country. She had a number of ministerial portfolios, but during her period as Prime Minister, she retained the portfolio of culture and heritage. Throughout her political career, she was a champion of Indigenous communities in New Zealand and their reconciliation with government and the population at large. Today, Helen leads a very important organization of the UN, the central development agency of the UN, the UNDP. Its budget falls in 2 parts, a so-called regular budget, around perhaps $1 billion, and then a very impressive range of voluntary contributions amounting to between $4 and $5 billion that it is entrusted with because it is considered the institution best able to steward those resources and deliver them. UNDP is present pretty well throughout the developing world. Unlike most donor governments, unlike most NGOs, and perhaps its most valuable role is that it reaches into parts of the developing world and is welcome in those parts of the developing world that many of the other donors do not reach. So what we'll do today is have a conversation. I hope Helen will say a few words first about what's on her mind. I'll have a few questions for her, and very quickly we'll open the floor to those of you wishing to intervene. There are 2 microphones. I will ask you to go to the microphones because otherwise the electronic systems won't pick you up, and we want to pick you up as well as any response from Ms. Clark. Si vous avez une question à poser en français,
If you have a question to ask in French, please do not hesitate. I'll do my best to interpret this question, to translate it to Mrs. Clark, who will answer your question in English, most likely. But do not hesitate to express yourself in the language of your choice. You know that we welcome her here to celebrate the 40th anniversary of IDRC. She is among a group of very prestigious speakers who join us for this occasion. Helen, à vous la parole.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everybody. David earlier over lunch said he was going to ask me what was on my mind, so I've kind of rehearsed it over lunch, what's on my mind. And I'll give a much shorter answer than I did over lunch. But in essence, apart from the many countries in profound crisis in which UNDP and the UN development system work, which are on one's mind constantly, if I look at the larger scene, I'm very preoccupied with now how to turn what has been quite a successful MDG summit in New York into a platform for further acceleration of MDG achievement, and also looking ahead to this year's climate event, Conference of Parties in Cancun, because a key part of UNDP's mandate is in linking interventions around climate, environment, energy with the poverty reduction agenda, and you've got to do them both together. So how the climate agreement, hoping that there is eventually one, works out and what form climate finance takes and what support there will be to build capacity of developing countries to actually access the finance is very much in our mind at the moment. The advisory group on finance, which the Secretary General established, is meeting in Addis Ababa as we speak, and we've put some inputs into that particular meeting. We're also looking ahead to the high-level event on aid effectiveness in Korea next year, the OECD DAC event, and what contribution we could make to that. Rio Plus 20 is coming up in a couple of years. The Secretary General's set up a high-level panel on global sustainability, which we will support. It's headed by the presidents of Finland and South Africa. And again, my hope would be that perhaps that panel can come up with a forward-looking agenda like the Brundtland Commission did, which then enables us to see this Rio Plus 20 summit as setting the agenda in sustainable development, environment issues linked to development for the next 20 years. So that's kind of on the big picture where my thinking's at the moment.
Terrific. Well, thank you for that. One thing that I think is both exciting and confusing for those of us who work in the development field is success in many developing countries. We're so used to rabbiting on about the desperate needs in the developing world that particularly in the development community, there's been a reluctance to recognize success that sometimes doesn't have much to do with the donors. It's hard to argue that China's success, for example, has much to do with international assistance. And even India's breakthrough after the early 1990s had very little to do with foreign assistance relative to the survival of India in earlier decades. And I wanted to ask you how in UNDP, as parts of the developing world are proving more resilient than the West in the recent crisis, how some countries are being extraordinarily successful, at least in terms of growth rates, perhaps not in other terms, how you organize your own thinking on a more complex world in development.
Well, you're right. The donor community couldn't really claim any credit for China's incredible success in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And I think where you see a lot of traction on basic development indicators, it generally comes from having governments which are able to drive agendas through, where there's capacity in government, there's a vision, there's a plan, and an ability to actually put it into operation. When we brought together an international assessment of what it would take to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, we put at the top of our list national leadership and ownership, because without that, nobody else can do the job. And then the rest of us as actors need to look at how we can be catalytic in what we do that might support that process. UNDP has been in China for 30 years, and there's no way we'd want to take the credit for hundreds of millions of people being lifted out of poverty either. But we have played a useful role. And the latest request from China when I was there last year, around the 30-year anniversary, was would we support China in two areas in particular. One was in terms of getting its poverty reduction strategy now focused on those who are missing out. Because while at the headline level, many people, hundreds of millions, are well above that poverty line, nonetheless they're conscious that their poverty is concentrated in particular regions, among particular groups, so they want to look at those equity issues. And the other area they've asked for support in is, of course, with the environment, because there is official recognition in China now that the economic growth has come at a very high environmental price. So they're looking at how they can make up lost ground on that, and they will pick the best brains from anywhere they can around the world. In fact, when I went as New Zealand Prime Minister in 2008, we had the same request made to us. Could you help us? And you're thinking, here I am from New Zealand, there's 4 million people, what could we do that would be remotely helpful? But China is absolutely in the market for ideas as to how it can pursue a more sustainable development path. So there'll always be a niche. There's always be a niche for development actors to come in and be supportive.
One very, I think, encouraging feature of a discouraging world economic situation over the last 2 or 3 years has been the resilience of Africa. Africa was always considered likely to be the prime victim of any global crisis, and perhaps coming out of this one, we'll be able to conclude some years from now that Africa is finding its own path to development with lots of support from institutions like your own, but that it's finding its way to success at long last.
Well, I'm an optimist about Africa, and I think it's so important that we see Africa with its young demographics as very much part of the answer to the world's problems. Look at the next 2 years of IMF projections for world growth. Sub-Saharan Africa will be the second fastest growing region in the world. And for those of us in Western countries with aging demographics, largely saturated with consumer goods, having satisfied most of the material demands we have, you know, our entrepreneurs are going to be looking for green fields, and green fields are truly there in Africa. And one of the bits of our work, which I think is increasingly important now, is how we link with the companies which are attracted to developing regions like Africa to work up not just corporate social responsibility, but actually more inclusive business models which build into them how there's also support for development in country and the way you source production, upskill labour, leave a legacy of infrastructure and other things behind. But I think we should be positive about Africa. We should acknowledge the very considerable achievements that many countries are making. You know, not every country is going to achieve every Millennium Development Goal, but to go to a country like Burkina Faso, as I did in May, and to see in a country where there's 28% adult literacy, they now have 66% of children in primary school. Well, it's not 100%, but from where they started this drive, it represents, you know, huge success. And I think that, you know, all of us getting them behind can support them to go those next miles. But you do see a lot of hope. You see a lot of problems too, but I think in development, as with everything else, you can be one of those people where the glass is always half full, or it can be, you know, mostly empty. Well, I'm in the more than half full camp, and I think there's a lot to build on.
On the Millennium Development Goals, one thing I noticed traveling around the world, the developing world, is while developing countries, rightly in many ways, hold donor countries accountable for their side of the bargain, in developing countries, the public is increasingly holding its own leadership accountable for achieving the Millennium Development Goals. And it strikes me over the 10 years of experience with the MDGs, that may be the single most positive feature of those goals, that populations have adopted them and are trying to hold their governments to them, which puts the pressure necessary on governments to try to achieve these goals.
Well, the Millennium Development Goals aren't perfect, and they don't speak to every aspect of development. But they are the most comprehensive set of time-bound and specific goals the world ever agreed to. And they do give, certainly, citizenry something to focus on. You know, those goals were about universal education. Well, why isn't it happening in my country? I can see country X where it has happened, and they don't seem to be so different from my country. So what's not happening here? What could we do? So I think it can be a focal point for, you know, rallying citizens around that development agenda. I was telling a story, I think, at CEDA earlier today, of going into the Electoral Commission headquarters in Tanzania, and which was a very impressive operation, I might say. But they brought together a group of young voters who were newly enrolled. And so I said to them, well, what issues are going to be important to you in the election in Tanzania later this year? And the first young woman who spoke said, development. We want to know that our politicians are passionate about development in our country. You know, we're young people. We want our country to develop, which I thought was a pretty amazing answer. So we are, you know, obviously living with the world's largest ever generation of young people. A lot of them around the world at the moment come into a world where there isn't a lot of work and isn't always a lot of opportunity. And we need to be very focused on what kind of world we can build which will use their talents.
Great. Now I'm going to encourage those in the room who would like to engage Helen Clark to go to the microphones. While we're doing that, there is a question from Alain Daou in Quebec, which focuses on what can be done to ensure ownership at local levels. And I know UNDP actually has quite a bit of experience of trying to galvanize the local level of both government and citizenry.
Yes, UNDP is active in a lot of countries on what's broadly called the decentralisation agenda, which is building the capacity of government at all levels. A lot of countries have come from a legacy where government is very centralised, and yet government close to the citizenry, the local councils as we know them, regional government, it needs competence, it needs organisation. So quite a lot of work is done at that particular level. And then you also see in a number of countries the MDGs being broken down to that local level as well. In fact, in the book that I've got with me on this trip on work we've done on how you accelerate the MDGs, one of the pilots we did was in Colombia, where there is a lot of conscious devolution of the targets down to the local level to get community ownership of them.
Great. Well, friends, do please, if you want to intervene, go to the microphones, because we're going to run out of time. We're going to be stopping this at 5 to 3, so the opportunity isn't infinite. In the meanwhile, something we were discussing at lunch with some others, the emergence of developing countries, some of them as donors, Brazil, India, China, but also a number of smaller countries are developing aid programs of their own. And I wanted to ask you about your perception of that phenomenon, whether the values and practices of these new donors are at variance with what we've known today, and what you like and perhaps like less about some of the new trends.
So you can't anymore divide the world neatly into donor countries and developing countries, because many of the developing countries are engaged in South-South cooperation, and not just the large emerging economies like the BRICS, but actually at all levels. If you go to Rwanda, you will find that Rwanda is being supported by Uruguay in this Laptop for Every Child initiative. I have a trail of ambassadors from developing countries come through my office talking about their cooperation, and they may be countries that we're not necessarily that familiar with as development actors in third countries. Chile, for example, projects itself through a small but what has been growing aid budget. So does Colombia, so does Egypt, so does Thailand, so do many, many, many countries. And it's not just about the money. In South-South cooperation, the least developed countries want to be able to share experiences which they've had which have been successful. So where does UNDP cut into that? We cut into it at the most fundamental level by being a repository of knowledge about what is happening out there and trying to link people with ideas, with things which on the evidence have worked. It happened there. Could we link to there? Could we see experts exchanged across regions, countries dealing with those sorts of problems? Then, of course, there are the mega South-South contributors of the China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, if I can categorise it as South-South, and so on. And they don't subscribe to the OECD DAC principles on aid effectiveness, but on the other hand, they don't want their aid to be ineffective. Who would? So there is scope for working with the emerging economies. We are starting to sign partnership agreements where the mandate and the ethics which we work to are consistent with that work, and I think it'll be a fast-growing field of activity.
Terrific. And we have people online, but we also have people in the room. So why don't we start here to the left with Carolyn McCaskey. Carolyn.
Thank you very much, David. Helen, you're the first woman head of the UN Development Programme. Congratulations. Yay. Applause all around. However, and you come from a country that treasures women's rights and has a real track record on it. I've spent a few more decades than I care to mention in development, including the last decade in the UN. And the UN, apart from certain pockets, very active pockets, actually doesn't have a good track record on women's issues. Now, finally, it took them 5 years from the 2005 summit, we have UN Women, the new UN Women's Agency, and the appointment of another dynamic head of state, Michelle Bachelet, to head it up. How do you, as the head of the key UN development organization, how do you see this development? Where do you think we can go with it? And what difference can we make? And what role will UNDP play? Just a couple of little questions.
Little questions. Well, look, it is a positive development. The UN has had little centres of activity for women, but they've been quite dispersed. They've been dispersed across UNIFEM, which has been an associated program of UNDP, across INSTRAW, mainly based in the Dominican Republic, the little research organisation, and then in New York itself around the Secretariat for CEDAW, etc. So to bring that into one hybrid agency, sort of policy, standard setting, compliance with conventions, plus a development role is clearly very important. And it couldn't have got off to a better start with a better leader, because Michelle Bachelet is a wonderful person to have recruited. The key thing is that its existence shouldn't be an excuse for everybody else saying women's issues have nothing to do with them. That would be a disaster, because UN Women, just like a women's ministry in any country, can't take the whole responsibility for shifting the status of women on itself. That is impossible. What I hope it will lead to is the UN country teams out there around the world doing things better. It will mean, for example, that the gender clusters in the country teams will be led by UN Women. Sometimes they're led by UN volunteers, and with all due respect to UN volunteers, it doesn't always send the right message if a volunteer is running a cluster on something as significant as gender. So it should help us to improve our programming and what we do, and do it better. And I know, across the agencies, people are supportive. And they're not seeing it as an excuse to down tools and say, oh, we'll leave it to UN Women, which would be quite the wrong thing.
Great. Could those at the microphone introduce themselves when it comes to your turn? Please, ma'am.
Dawn Conway, Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Sciences. So my question is climate related. You mentioned in your comments about what was on your mind 2 climate related activities coming up. One of the concerns is, of course, with the huge anticipated impact of climate changes on vulnerable peoples. 50 million environmental refugees by 2050, according to IPCC. And, of course, we're already seeing climate-related conflicts. Could you comment on that and the role of UNDP? Has this altered in any way your programming or thinking? Are there partnerships with UNEP, for example, or other bodies? Or just generally, what is UNDP's approach to climate-related conflicts and crises and changes in the world? Thank you.
Well, certainly a very close relationship with the UN Environment Program going forward is critical. UN Environment Program, of course, has a mandate which goes across all countries. It's not a development agency as such. It's a normative agency, and it's as relevant to New Zealand and Canada as it is to Niger and Eritrea. But it has an enormous amount of expertise, which we need to link with to inform the programming that we support in program countries. So that's the first point. The second point is that the issues of adaptation to climate, cleaner development pathways going forward, energy that's more sustainable, are very, very big issues for us now. And we do see them as totally linked to the poverty reduction agenda. Obviously, there is a level of climate change occurring now, which is inevitable. It's here and now. It's not an abstract issue that people are going to have to deal with in decades' time. And developing countries do need help, and rather fast on this, which is why a climate agreement, which does start to get something close to the $100 billion a year funding into adaptation and mitigation by 2020 is pretty important. The Copenhagen Accord put out about $30 billion over the 2010 to 2012 period, most of it going out bilaterally from the Western donors, but all is appreciated. And our role has been supporting developing countries to articulate their interests in the negotiations, supporting them to access the funding which is available now, which hasn't been so easy with mechanisms like the Clean Development Mechanism, where most of the money has not gone to poor countries at all. So in the climate finance going forward, we do have an interest in seeing that whatever its form, and obviously for developing countries, grants are always preferable to loans, but whatever its form, that there is built into the funding mechanism a recognition that countries will need support to build capacity to access funding, draw up strategies, be able to monitor and verify them, account for money, and actually produce initiatives which will have a beneficial result for adaptation and mitigation. So it's a big part of our agenda.
Thank you. Please, Tony.
Helen, I'm former DFATE, long retired. A couple of questions, which I think, I'll put them very short, David, would perhaps relate more to your previous assignment than your present one, but if you wouldn't mind taking them all the same. I think they resonate into your present one. When you looked at it from the point of view of a New Zealand budget, foreign aid is not necessarily the biggest vote getter that you can put forward. I mean, it's in Canada it's regarded as, the sport is inch deep and mile wide, that sort of issue. So you must have come up against that, I suspect, in New Zealand, and you were required, I suppose, to defend it against critics and who would then quote Dumbiza Moyo at you. And I suspect you come up against that a little bit even in your present assignment. What were the sort of arguments you used to discount her thesis? The second question is one of trade policy, which I suspect was one which you still think about Canada fondly when you think about
particularly the dairy industry.
The dairy industry. But in the present day, is it important that we complete the Doha round? Do we really care? Should we stop subsidizing agriculture in a hungry world? Thank you.
Well, I think you've raised a really important issue, because if ODA isn't complemented by writing fairer trade rules, reaching climate agreements, dealing with the fiscal space issues for developing countries, and the way the IFIs act towards them, then aid on its own can't do much. There's bigger environment out there that people are having to act within. So I think it's right to lump all those things in together. With respect to the arguments for ODA, I think they fall into two categories. I mean, there's always the philanthropic argument, the moral argument of my neighbour's poor, I'm poor too, and that's spurred generosity at the individual level in our countries and at the community and national levels. But I think in the aftermath of a global recession, leaders are often looking for harder-headed arguments as well. And that's where I think you come to some of the arguments about the importance of development in a Western country's self-interest. For example, the point I raised earlier about who are we going to trade to? Where's the dynamism in new markets? It's not necessarily in our own saturated countries, but it's going to be as living standards pick up elsewhere in the world. There's also the issue about development really being the best long-term answer to security issues. There's the arguments you hear in parts of the world now very concerned about illegal migration. Well, illegal migration is propelled by lack of opportunity at home, by a push factor. So if people are concerned about that, then development again back in country, which minimises the push factor. And there's not a lot of pull factor necessarily in the West with the high unemployment these days, so there's got to be a big push factor to still be motivating people to try desperate and dangerous journeys to a new life. So I think, you know, there's really that whole range of reasons why it's in everybody's interests for countries to be able to develop and raise living standards. You mentioned, I think, sort of we're getting to the point of ODA levels. You know, New Zealand, you know, like Canada, hasn't been near the 0.7 at all. But there were broader indices done on what contributions did countries make to development overall, and on that we scored rather well because of the total openness to trade, the fact that we opened our labour markets to people from the South Pacific neighbours, both for permanent migration and for seasonal work schemes, and we were active in our region on basic peace building in the Pacific and East Timor in particular. And when you put those things together with the ODA level, we came out rather high. So I think it is important to take that broader view.
Great, Helen.
Well, we were due for 15-16, but maybe Cairns will be thinking about strategies at the moment.
Please, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Ted Schrecker from the Institute of Population Health at the University of Ottawa, and I got into the global health research that has occupied me for the last several years by way of a project that was funded by IDRC, so if it weren't for the Institute, I wouldn't be here. When you hear my question, you may or may not think that's a good thing. Some of the people associated with World Institute for Development Economics research are a bit less optimistic than yourself, Helen, about the future path of development because of the potential for something they're calling a triple crisis, which involves the interacting effects of financial volatility, which they think is not going to go away, fossil fuel dependence, and food insecurity. So I wonder whether you could reflect just a bit on the potential downside risks for the next 10 or 20 years. What if everything doesn't go as planned or as hoped?
Well, we've been living through a combination of those crises. You know, we've been challenged by the global recession, before that by the food price crisis, the fuel price spikes of 2008 as well, and then this incredible series of natural disasters. And I think what that points us to is both the need for more effective global economic governance, so we don't have a deck of cards built up again that dashes everybody's prospects, but also for support for greater resilience in developing countries, because all countries have been affected by these phenomena to some extent or another. But the difference in the developed world is the mechanisms that are there to deal with adversity, and in particular, I'd single out disaster risk mitigation and also social protection systems. You know, many countries, and I'm sure Canada included, certainly my own, put in place social protection systems not when they were rich countries, but when actually people were relatively poor. And they came, certainly in my country at the time of the Great Depression, where people were completely knocked off their perch, families, hopes and aspirations were completely destroyed, as we see with a major economic crisis in developing countries today where there's no social protection. So we're very strong advocates of social protection being seen as part of the answer, not a luxury for rich countries, but an absolutely essential precondition of building resilience to withstand crisis, keep children in school, keep food on the table, keep access to healthcare and so on. And then there's the issue of disaster risk mitigation. You know, a major city in my own country suffered an earthquake larger than Haiti's about 2 months ago. There were no deaths. Now, we're not hearing anyone moan about the building code in New Zealand at the moment. Usually people moan about regulation. Why do I have to do this? Well, not anymore, because it was a devastating event. But the measures being put in place to live in the dynamic geological environment we live in have been absolutely shown to prove their worth. So we know at the global level that effective disaster risk mitigation will work. And one of the things I think we have to do to underpin development traction is spread greater preparedness to natural disaster as a key and central part of our development work. Some of it's climate related, as we were discussing before, but others is just sheer natural phenomenon related, where we have to live with dynamic natural forces. So look, yes, there are all these huge challenges, and they have made life more difficult. But it also focuses, I think, on some of the basics in development where we could have a catalytic effect of trying to build some greater resilience. The other good thing is that food security is coming right back into the centre of development strategy. It hadn't been there for a long time with disastrous consequences, and we have to put it back at the centre of what we're trying to do in development.
Thank you. Please, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Jean-Pierre Chabot, and I'm actually currently doing an MBA.
Could you speak closer
Sorry,
to the microphone?
yes. My name is Jean-Pierre Chabot, and I'm currently doing an MBA program in emerging markets. You spoke a little bit to the question I would like to ask. I was wondering if the UNDP is currently or would be considering providing funding for governments to conduct geological surveys, both for economic reasons, but also, as you mentioned just prior, for security reasons as well.
We have a part of UNDP dedicated to crisis prevention and recovery, and that's not only political security crisis, it's natural disaster crisis and recovery as well. So disaster risk reduction is quite a big part again of the portfolio, and part of that can certainly involve the sort of survey that you suggest in areas which are prone particularly to seismic disaster.
Ma'am?
Thank you. My name is Sala from University of Ottawa, country of origin Botswana. I would like to say that it's very pleasing or heartwarming to hear that there are some success stories from Africa. And as a committed African who is trying to do the level best, I just want to ask one quick question about the policy, policy borrowing framework that has been used over the years. Currently, we are seeing a number of African countries, I would say, enjoying their first half-century birthday celebration, which is good. And some are coming along with good story, and some are still grappling with many issues. But my quick question is, how does UNDP approach the issue of policy borrowing framework that is constantly used by governments, which to me and my observation, when it comes to implementation stage, which a lot of governments come in at that stage, they fail to be there when the policy is formulated. They just maybe, as they join consortiums and sign on these other levels, they kind of take over these. How does UNDP look at that approach that has been used for the last 50 years? And this question takes back to capacity building in developing countries. Thank you.
So our position is that it's absolutely critical to build capacity in country, that you can't transplant it. You can't bring in a template. You can't say, this is the way you're going to do it, and here's the experts who'll do it for you, or you never get any traction at all. Our approach is that you have to build that capacity within country, and so we look at how we can support governments to build their ministries, build the capacity to plan, budget, prioritise, allocate, get things done, and that's what's going to be sustainable in the long run. I had someone approach me at the morning tea of something I was at a while back, who said, why don't we just go in and do these things? I said, well, but you can't. Countries need to be supported to build that indigenous capacity to do it for themselves. That's what's going to have the greatest effect in the long run. That's what will be sustainable long after the donors have gone, the door's been shut. The legacy has to be that people were empowered to take charge of their own development and drive it forward. That's what motivates me. And One point I would like to make, David, is that in the international assessment we did of what it would take to reach the MDGs, we started looking at this concept of inclusive growth, because we note that obviously in the decade up to about 2008, a lot of countries in Africa had growth that looked great, 6 to 8% a year, but in so many the poverty level didn't fall. Why was this? Well, partly it was because often with large rural populations there'd been no investment in the rural sector or agriculture. Ghana's an honourable exception, by the way, and did bring down its hunger levels and its poverty levels with the agriculture focus, but others hadn't had that focus. So the growth was often coming off the investment in mining, and unless you've got a good deal with the company, unless you've got the offsets, the skills development, the infrastructure legacy, the downstream processing, the ability to tax it, the ability to put the money into the schools and the health system and the housing and the whole virtuous cycle of development, a headline growth level doesn't necessarily take you very far. So, we're really feeling extremely motivated about how to support countries devising more inclusive growth models that really will work for ordinary people.
Now, we have 2 more questioners, and I'm going to end with them. We also have somebody from online, if we have time. But first, you, please, sir.
George Wright, independent researcher in democratic development and human rights. The BRICS, I'd like to ask you, Helen, about the paradox, particularly Brazil and India, to some extent China. The dynamism, the economic growth, and yet these are 3 countries with the greatest variance of disparities in income and class within their own societies. I'm a little confused of how countries at the same time can have this dynamism as far as potential for UNDP and even now as independent donors, and yet by the same time have these horrific differences in income levels.
Thank you.
Well, it's true. The inequalities are very large, and as I said with China, it's interesting to me that their approach to UNDP with their next anti-poverty strategy was, will you help us look at the inequalities issue? Because I think the leaders of such countries are conscious that if you have growing inequalities, that does undermine the social stability and harmony that you need to pursue a good development path. So let's not think that leaders are blind to these issues. I think they're acutely aware of them. In Brazil, you can certainly see that President Lula's focus and leadership has been very much on how to, bring people well down the ladder in Brazil to better standards of living, and you can show it's made a difference. But it's not quick. South Africa is another one where the inequalities are big. The government is acutely conscious of it, but you're dealing with a long legacy that we're all familiar with, which has cast a lot of people into very, very difficult circumstances. So, yes, you do have the irony that very powerful geopolitical forces from the South who are active in development cooperation have huge development issues at home, but they are the first to say that. When you go to China, the leaders will always remind one that their GDP per capita is not at this time in the top 100 in the world. So, they've got issues at home too, and I think are pretty committed in their own way to dealing with them.
Monsieur, please.
Thank you very much. Fidelis Folifak, PhD candidate from McGill University. I'm very proud to say my PhD work, sponsored by IDRC, focuses on building local governance in water supply. This has given me the opportunity to work with several stakeholders. And today you mentioned a lot about capacity building. But my work increasingly is unraveling that the issue is more capacity mobilization. And I'd asked this question to the president of IDRC when he was in Montreal for the launching of ISID. each time we talk about development, I get lost what it is. But I think we all know more that in sub-Saharan Africa, the issue is more that we fail to put polycentric governance at the center of development. And when we speak about development, we tend to give the place of governance as secondary issue, yet we see to talk about building the capacity, giving aid to Africa and others. It doesn't work anymore. We have to find a new approach to the development of Africa. We have to reverse the trend that we get all big NGOs going to Africa to do a flash flood of development and running back to the north. Is it not time for CRDI, IDRC, UNDP to think about a new approach to African development where it's not just about aid, where Africans have to sit around the table and discuss about their own development and define the priorities rather than following the priorities you guys said? Thank you very much.
Great.
Yeah, well, we certainly don't set priorities for people, I can assure you. Our programs are there to be aligned with the national development vision and then to see how could we add value? What could we do that would be supportive of that? But as I said in reply to the earlier question, we don't go in with a template and say, this is the way you do it. It's got to come from within. The leadership has to come from within, and then we can look at how we can be supportive. And everything we do is a program negotiated with the authorities at whatever level, local, regional, central. So I think you'll find our approach is very much geared to supporting whether we're mobilising capacity, developing capacity, building, whatever, very sensitive to and in tune with the national agenda.
Great. Helen, two last points from our friends on the web. The first asks an interesting question. Is the fashion going to turn from aid effectiveness, which has been a mantra of a number of donors recently, and also some countries and communities that receive aid, to wider development effectiveness? Focus less on the aid, focus more on the resulting development. So that's one question. The other, from Tara Tracy in Ottawa, simply asks about the role of civil society relative to that of the private sector and government in development.
Well, on civil society, I think the role of civil society in the countries in which we work is extremely important, because often you're looking for local partner organisations who are going to relate very closely to the needs of communities, just as governments and Western societies often look for civil society partners to be critical in social policy and other delivery. At the level of civil society in Western countries, I think the voice articulating advocacy for development is also extremely powerful, and I think the ability to mobilise people in support of a wider public good, if you like, is critical. In terms of development effectiveness versus aid effectiveness, well, probably theses will be written about this, but let me just say, if we're looking for overall development effectiveness, I do think we have to look at these policy coherence questions, that it's not enough just to give ODA. What's your trade policy doing for poor countries? What's your stance on climate negotiations doing for poor countries? What's the way in which you cast your vote at the IMF doing for poor countries? Let's look at some wider policy coherence here, because otherwise ODA can end up as being the charitable, but within a set of rules which aren't particularly fair. I think we've got to look at the whole landscape here and look at what the impact on development is.
Well, I'm happy we end on that note, because it came up several times, both from the room and people intervening and from you, that the aid part of the equation, which is an important one, is just part of a complex equation, and that the other elements are very important also. It's wonderful to have at UNDP an individual who is a champion of broader thinking on development, who doesn't necessarily reach for the latest technological or technocratic, let's say, fix. And I think we can all be very happy that having achieved great things quite young in your own country, you then still had the disposition to take on the international level. So thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you.